The first time Arelia saw humans, she was unimpressed. They were smaller than her kind, softer, their frames built for endurance rather than power. Their skin lacked the bioluminescent markings of the Velith, their eyes dull compared to the iridescent gold of her people. And yet, despite their apparent frailty, humans had carved a place for themselves among the stars, their influence spreading across the galaxy through alliances, diplomacy, and, when necessary, war. She had come to Earth as part of an interspecies cultural exchange, a diplomatic envoy tasked with learning their ways. It was an assignment she had accepted with neither excitement nor reluctance, merely a sense of duty. The Velith prided themselves on adaptability, and she was determined to master human culture as swiftly as she had mastered countless others. And yet, in all her studies, in all her careful observations of human behavior, nothing had baffled her more than the phrase, "ladies first." Her first encounter with the custom had been minor, easily dismissed. A human, a male, had gestured toward a doorway and said the words with an easy smile. She had hesitated, unsure of his intentions. It had not been a demand, nor had it been an order. And yet, there had been an expectation in the way he stood, waiting for her to move before he did. She had entered, dismissing the act as an isolated peculiarity. But it was not isolated. It happened again, and again. Each time she was met with the phrase, she found herself growing increasingly perplexed. Humans, it seemed, had an unspoken rule that dictated females should always be granted precedence in certain situations. Men held doors open, allowed women to step forward first, even relinquished seats in their favor. It was not a matter of rank or status. She had seen it practiced among humans of all classes. The concept was, to her, entirely alien. Velith society operated on merit. Males and females were equals, each proving their worth through skill, intelligence, and strength. There was no expectation of special treatment, no tradition that dictated a female should be prioritized over a male without reason. To Arelia, the human custom seemed not only unnecessary but illogical. She had resolved to investigate the matter further. Her assigned human liaison, a man named Dorian had been the perfect candidate for her inquiry. He was not particularly remarkable in appearance. His frame was lean, his dark hair perpetually tousled, his eyes sharp with quiet intelligence. He did not possess the brute strength of a warrior nor the commanding presence of a leader. And yet, there was something about him that intrigued her. Their first conversation on the subject occurred during a walk through one of the human cities. It was a strange place, filled with towering structures of glass and steel, its streets alive with the hum of conversation and the distant wail of sirens. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the pavement glistening from a recent storm. Dorian had been speaking of Earth's history, explaining the complexities of human governance, when the opportunity to question him arose. A group of humans approached from the opposite direction, moving toward a narrow entrance to a building. Without hesitation, Dorian stepped aside, motioning for Arelia to proceed first. "After you," he said. She stopped, tilting her head. "Why?" His brow furrowed slightly, as if confused by her confusion. "It's just polite." "That is not an answer," she said. "Why must I go first? You are my guide. Should you not enter before me to ensure the space is safe?" Dorian chuckled. "I mean, I could, but it's a human thing. Ladies first." "There it is again," she murmured. "Ladies first. Why? Is this a display of dominance or submission?" He raised an eyebrow. "Neither." She studied him carefully. "Then explain." Dorian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just how we were raised. It's a sign of respect." "Respect must be earned," she countered. "You do not know all females, yet you extend this courtesy without discrimination." "Well, yeah," he said with a shrug. "It's about consideration." "For what?" There was a pause before he answered. "For everything women go through." She narrowed her eyes. "Elaborate." Dorian shifted on his feet. "It's complicated. Historically, women didn't always have equal rights. They had to fight for their place in society. These customs, they're kind of a way to acknowledge that Arelia was silent. The Violith had never suffered such inequalities. Strength and intelligence dictated success, not gender. That a species would create customs to compensate for past injustices was interesting. Still, she did not fully understand. That night, she continued her research. She scoured human records, reading about centuries of struggle, of laws that once denied women opportunities, of movements that reshaped societies. It was fascinating, if not somewhat bewildering. Yet, despite all she learned, she still did not grasp the personal significance of it. It remained an abstract concept, something separate from her own experiences. It was not until a week later that she witnessed a moment that made her reconsider. They had been at a cafe, an Earth establishment where humans gathered to consume stimulants and speak of trivial things. She had been sipping a bitter drink called coffee, an acquired taste, when a group of human males entered. They were loud, their laughter sharp, their gazes lingering on her with an intensity she found unsettling. It was not uncommon for humans to stare. Her features were different, her bioluminescent markings a curiosity. But the way these men looked at her was not with curiosity. It was something else, something she did not like. One of them muttered something under his breath, a crude remark she did not fully understand but recognized as an insult. Before she could respond, Dorian had moved. His posture, usually relaxed, had shifted. His eyes, typically warm, were cold. He had stepped between her and the men without hesitation. His voice calm but edged with steel. "You got something to say?" he asked. The men hesitated. Dorian did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. But there was something in his presence that made the group mutter apologies and retreat. When he turned back to her, his expression softened. "You okay?" She was not sure how to answer. She was Violith. She was strong. She could have handled the situation herself. And yet, something about his instinctive reaction unsettled her in a way she did not understand. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Dorian blinked. "Because they were being assholes." "That is not an answer," he sighed. "Because you shouldn't have to deal with that." She studied him, trying to decipher the strange warmth in her chest. "You defended me, of course. You believe I could not handle it?" "No," he said, and his voice was firm. "I know you could have, but you shouldn't have had to." Her fingers tightened around her cup. She had never needed protection, never wanted it. And yet, the way he said those words, the way he had acted without hesitation, she had never encountered anything like it. Dorian sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I get that some of our customs probably don't make sense to you, but sometimes it's not about logic. It's about care." She frowned. "Care?" "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "And you might not get it yet, but that's okay." She was not sure she would ever get it. And yet, for the first time, she wanted to try. Arelia could not stop thinking about the incident at the cafe. She had never encountered such behavior before. Not just from Dorian, but from anyone. Among her people, strength was respected, and the idea of stepping in to defend another, especially without an obvious tactical advantage, was rare. The Violith did not believe in shielding others from discomfort or hardship. One either endured or overcame. Yet Dorian had acted as if it was his responsibility to intercede, despite knowing she was more than capable of handling the situation herself. It gnawed at her, the way he had positioned himself between her and those men, the way he had not hesitated, the way he had said, "You shouldn't have to deal with that." It was a concept foreign to her, protection not because of weakness but because of what? Care, as he had said? Consideration? It did not make sense. And yet, for reasons she could not quite articulate, it made her restless. She found herself watching Dorian more closely in the following days. He was different from the other humans she had observed. Though he was not the loudest in a room nor the most physically imposing, there was a quiet steadiness to him. He was not afraid to challenge her questions, but he never dismissed them outright. When she pointed out contradictions in human behavior, he would pause, considering his answers carefully. And yet, despite his intelligence, there was an infuriating ease to him as well. He would smirk at her confusion, tease her with that insufferable human grin of his. He seemed to enjoy her frustration, as though her inability to grasp his customs was endlessly amusing, which was precisely why she had decided to put his human chivalry to the test. The next time they visited a human establishment, she experimented. When he reached for the door, she stepped ahead of him and pulled it open first, staring at him expectantly. He blinked, clearly surprised, before stepping through without comment. She was not satisfied. Later, when they reached a transport, she deliberately motioned for him to enter before her. He hesitated, as if the act physically pained him, before relenting with a small shake of his head. She was still not satisfied. So she escalated. She found the most trivial, unnecessary human customs regarding female precedence and did the opposite at every opportunity. When they reached a staircase, she went first, ensuring he followed. When they encountered a narrow passage, she motioned for him to step through before her. When he attempted to hand her a drink first, she gently nudged it back toward him. At first, he seemed bemused. Then, slowly, irritation crept into his expression. And then, finally, he cracked. "Okay," Dorian said one evening, setting his drink down with more force than necessary. "Are you messing with me?" Arelia sipped her coffee. "Messing?" He leveled a stare at her. "Yeah. You've been acting weird." "I am behaving precisely as my people would," she said coolly. "Is this not how things should be? A person of ability does not require unnecessary deference." His expression shifted. "It's not about ability." "Then what?" she pressed. Dorian exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "Look, it's just," he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "You don't have to follow our customs, okay? But you also don't have to prove a point every 5 seconds. She tilted her head. "Is that not what you do?" "What?" Arelia found herself thinking about Dorian more often than she cared to admit. His words lingered in her mind, replaying at odd moments when she least expected them. "I care about you." Care. The word had no direct equivalent in her language. The closest approximation was a term used in battle, to shield an ally in combat, to cover their blind spots. But Dorian's meaning had not been tactical. It had been personal. She had faced countless warriors, had stood unflinching against threats that would have made others cower. And yet, the quiet honesty in his voice that night had unsettled her more than any enemy ever had. She did not know what to do with it. So, as she always did when confronted with uncertainty, she sought more information. She observed humans carefully, paying closer attention to their interactions. She watched how human men treated human women, how they opened doors, how they walked slightly ahead to clear a path, how they instinctively positioned themselves between a companion and perceived danger. She noticed, too, how women reacted. Some smiled. Some rolled their eyes but still accepted the gestures. A few, like her, resisted at first, only to relent when the effort to fight seemed more exhausting than the custom itself. But what stood out most was that none of them seemed to question why. This was simply how things were. She hated that answer. Arelia needed something tangible, something she could understand. And so, when she next saw Dorian, she did not hesitate. "Explain," she demanded. Dorian, who had just taken a bite of food, choked slightly. "Explain what?" "This," she gestured between them. "This custom, this behavior. You said it is instinct, but instinct can be overridden. If it is not necessity, and it is not logic, then why?" Dorian swallowed, looking at her warily. "You really don't let things go, do you?" "No," she said firmly. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Arelia, it's not that deep." "It is that deep," she insisted. "You do not do this with other women. You do it with me. That means it is deliberate." Dorian sighed. "All right, fine. You want the real answer." "Yes." His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. "Because I like you." Arelia felt her pulse quicken. "You? Like me?" "Yes," he said simply. "I like you, Arelia." Her mind scrambled to process the words. In her culture, like was an inadequate term. One either held respect or one did not. One either valued an ally or one dismissed them. And yet, the way Dorian said it, soft, unwavering, made her feel as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She struggled to keep her voice neutral. I am unfamiliar with this context of, like. Dorian gave her a small, almost amused smile. It means I think about you more than I probably should. It means I notice things. Like the way you tilt your head when you're trying to dissect something, or how you get this crease between your brows when you're annoyed. She blinked. You study me? He laughed. I guess I do. Arelia was at a loss for words. She had spent so much time analyzing him, and yet it had never occurred to her that he might have been doing the same. Dorian leaned forward slightly, his expression more serious now. Look, I get that my customs don't make sense to you, and maybe they never will, but this isn't about some ancient tradition or outdated gender roles. It's just me. It's how I choose to act around you. She swallowed. Because you care. His eyes softened. Yeah, the air between them felt charged, as if something unspoken had settled between them. Arelia had faced countless battles, had endured rigorous training to become a warrior of her people. But this moment, with Dorian looking at her like she was something more than just an alien visitor, felt like an entirely different kind of challenge. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to fight it. Arelia had never hesitated in battle. Every decision she made was swift, precise, unburdened by emotion. Yet, as she sat across from Dorian, his quiet confession still lingering between them, she felt uncharacteristically uncertain. She had spent her entire life valuing strength, control, and logic. But this was something else entirely. Dorian had said he liked her, that he cared about her, and, despite all her attempts to dismiss his customs as mere human sentimentality, she could not deny that something in her responded to his words. She could not deny that she had begun to care, too. But what did that mean? Her people did not form bonds like humans did. Violith partnerships were built on mutual survival, on alliances forged through battle and hardship. They did not speak of emotions, did not prioritize feelings over function. And yet, when Dorian looked at her like that, like she was something rare and worth understanding, she felt something deep within her shift. She had spent so much time trying to understand him, to decipher his customs. But maybe this wasn't something that could be analyzed like a battle strategy. Maybe it was something that simply was. Dorian must have sensed her turmoil because he leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You don't have to say anything, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I know this is probably a lot. She studied him, noting the way his fingers drummed idly against the table, a subtle sign of tension. He was giving her space, not pressuring her for an answer. It was such a human thing to do. And yet, she found she did not want space. She wanted to understand this. Him. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Dorian stilled, his breath catching. Arelia wasn't sure what compelled her to do it, only that she had seen humans express connection this way, and right now, she wanted him to know that she heard him, that she had felt what he said. His skin was warm beneath her palm, his fingers slightly rough from a life of physical labor. She traced the sensation, memorizing it, committing it to memory. She met his gaze. I do not know what this means for us, she admitted. I do not even know how to begin understanding it. Dorian's lips twitched in the ghost of a smile. Yeah. Feelings are complicated like that, she exhaled. They are inefficient. He chuckled. Maybe. But sometimes inefficiency makes life interesting. Arelia thought about that for a moment. She had spent her whole life seeking efficiency, order. And yet, in all her years, nothing had intrigued her as much as this, as much as him. Her fingers curled slightly over his. Then, I wish to understand more. Dorian's smile widened, his grip tightening ever so slightly around hers. I'd like that. They sat there in comfortable silence, neither rushing to define what was happening between them. For the first time, Arelia allowed herself to stop thinking, to stop analyzing. Perhaps there were things in life that did not need to be dissected, only experienced. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was one of them.